Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning at our 2018 Budget Committee meeting. My name is Mike Mann. I'm a councillor for the Preston area of Cambridge. And before we get started, I just want to introduce the committee to you because not everybody knows who everybody is. And so I'll start to my immediate left, which is your right, and we have Gary Price, Mayor Doug Craig, and Councillor Donna Reid. And to my right and your left, we have George Schlepsky, Nicholas Ramada, and Mike Devine. Just before we get started, I want to give you a brief idea of how this is going to function this morning. I'm going to have some opening comments, and then Mr. Gary Dyke, the city manager, will have his comments. Then we'll have delegations, and I think we have one or two delegations this morning. We'll deal with the water and sewer increases. Then we'll deal with the capital budget, and finally the operating budget. And as far as the schedule for the day, we will have our first break no later than 10:30. Lunch will be at noon, and a second break at 2:30. And today's business will complete by 4 o'clock. So that gives you an idea of what the schedule is for today, so you can adjust yourselves accordingly. You know, back in August, staff started working on a budget, and it was in excess of 7.35%. And certainly before that even came to council, staff were directed to go back and take a look at the budget and come back with something that was much less than that, because certainly 7.35% was out of line. They came back and they did a lot of work, and they came back to 5.78%. And that's where we start today, with a budget that looks at 5.78%. Prior to this committee meeting, we had 3 road shows that were conducted in Preston, Galt, and Hespeler. And in Hespeler, we were reminded of a 4.2% prediction for 2018 when we did the three-year multi-year budget back in 2015. And that was something that we had to strive for, because that was the guideline that we had predicted back in 2015 for this next budget. Certainly one of the drivers to put us over the 4.2% is the collective agreement settlements for both our inside and outside workers. And those settlements were higher than we had predicted and higher than we had calculated back in 2015. There are other drivers, and we'll hear about those as the budget unfolds today. Certainly 5.78 is higher than any of us would like to see, and it is not acceptable. We've heard that from the community. And this committee has very difficult decisions to make about where we go. We have got to learn to say no. There are going to be things that we're going to say no to. And that's not something we're very good at, but we have got to do it, because if we're going to get the budget to something that is going to be acceptable, that we can present to the community, there are things we have to say no to. For those in the audience, you will have the opportunity to make a presentation to the committee. And before we get started, I'm going to ask Mr. Gary Dyke to bring his comments from the city.
Thank you, Councillor. Just quickly to build upon what Councillor Mann has brought forward is the budget process is quite long and involved. We're dealing with, what you're going to see today is dealing with 3 separate budgets for the city, being the water waste budget, capital investment budget, and our annual operating budgets. And just important to note for the people here today is that the water and wastewater budget, which you'll hear first, is a little different than the operating wastewater and the capital budgets, insofar as they're non-tax-based supported, as the revenues generated for this budget is directly related to the rates that we charge for the water and wastewater services, where the capital investment and operating are primarily based on tax-based supported ventures. As Chairman has identified, through our review of the budget over the last 5 to 6 months, staff has eliminated roughly $1.5 million in operating costs from the budget. based on, these are sustainable costs. These are $1.5 million of costs that will not reappear in the budget in subsequent years. We just haven't kind of kicked the can down the road, so to speak. It's actually those are sustainable costs that have currently been pulled out of the budget. And this has been a trend we've had over the last number of years with respect to the tightening of the actual operational costs of the budget itself. And what we're looking at now is, as we go forward from this, is we will be requesting from the Budget Committee and in through Council is the authorization to conduct a service review with respect to how and what services we deliver to the city over the next number of years. And we're looking for that would be, that review would take place over the course of 2018, and we're looking for implementation in 2019 and going forward on that. You will hear some comments about what impacts the budget, and these are just statements of fact. They're not commentary on the level of service. They're not commentary on the type of service we receive, but they're just facts of the cost of that service it costs us to deliver. So you'll hear the impacts of the new library. You'll hear the impacts of Station 6 into the budget, the impacts of the collective bargaining agreements, and those aren't meant to be derogatory in any way or negative in any way. Those are just facts of life, and those are the costs of us doing business over the last couple of years going forward. So they will be dealt with in much more specifics as we move forward. And I think with that, Mr. Chairman, I turn over to Mr. Fairweather yourself to begin the process.
Thank you, Mr. Dyke. And just before we do get started with Mr. Fairweather, I'd just like to ask the committee if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest. And having seen none, then we'll proceed, and I'll ask. Maybe we'll go with the delegations first. And Patrick Milady. Is Patrick Milady here? Sir, if you would come forward and just give your name and address. Thank you and welcome.
Take off. Yes, good morning. My name is Patrick Milady. I live at 12 Highgrove Court in Cambridge. I've been a resident of Cambridge for the last 30 some odd years. I found Cambridge to be a community city that's been well run, and on November 13th I had the singularly almost distasteful opportunity to attend a budget review roadshow, apparently, in Hespeler. I went in to learn why are we looking at 5 point some astronomical number, 5.78, 5.43. I don't recall which one it was, but I know that it was higher than I had ever anticipated we'd see. And I went in and introduced myself, and the why I was there was to learn, how does it get to be so high? The first question I was asked by staff and the politicians that were there was, what would you cut? Now, I didn't go to talk about what needs to be cut. I went to find out why is it so high? Why are we looking at an increase that's astronaut, quite frankly, in excess of what I would have anticipated? You know, consumer price index should indicate that you'd be at like 1.7, maybe 1.5. If you're paying attention to the way you're doing your bargaining, you should be able to bring it down more. Apparently we didn't. And as I went through the process of listening to what was going on and reading through your it's a really quite a lovely draft 2018 budget summary report. At page 7, there's a fairly scary graphic where the Cambridge rate, tax rate increase jumps. And that was disconcerting to me. So I asked myself, so how does this happen? So at 1.1, my benchmark is a consumer price index. I'm a consumer. I live here. We're all consumers. And I find that the municipality and perhaps not just this municipality, but a number of municipalities in the public sector, have decided that because they can't control their spending, they will have their own municipal price index. Now, in the meeting at the session in November 13th, there was one fellow expressed the opinion that Fraser Institute will suggest that public sector costs are over and above what you'd expect in a competitive private sector market by 15 to 20%. And curiously enough, when you look at the page 7, 1.1, the municipal price index at 2.04% versus the CPI index at 1.7%, the quantum, the percentage increase that the municipal price index yields is a 20% premium on being a consumer. I, for the life of me, do not understand why I paid for the development of yet another index to tell me I should pay you more because you're profligate spenders. Now, this is not just the city of Cambridge. It might well indeed apply to the region, the province, and the federal government. But I know this, that when I have a requirement to spend, I assure myself that I spend only what needs to be spent. My policy recommendation to council would be that every time you send something out to tender, instead of accepting that we're going to pay a 20% premium, maybe you need to send everything back to wherever it comes from, in the supply contract or in whatever it is, and say, I think you're gaming me. I need a reduction. I expect that this will come back at 15 to 20% less than your number. And if you're not interested in supplying service, then that'll be the way it goes. So I look at this and I found that to be preposterous. And then as I go through, I find that we have other things that have caused our costing and budget to get out of control. And it's at 2.1, where we talk about salaries, wages, and benefits. And I'll come back to the negotiated settlements and those. But the one that I find singularly intriguing is Cambridge as a living wage community. Now, this is something that I'm just a taxpayer, a ratepayer, property owner. I, for the life of me, do not understand how creating a living wage community contributes to the value of my property or the services that I consume. Because that is, in point of fact, the base upon which you extract dollars out of my pocket. When the living wage status, living wage community was adopted, what were the metrics that were used by council at the time? Was it, I feel good? Or was there a payback, a payoff? And I ask that as an open question now. I'm not asking anybody to answer it. I'm asking that, my policy recommendation going forward would be that anytime you engage in spending of taxpayer dollars, ratepayer dollars, my dollars, you assure yourself that you can explain to me directly how this will affect and improve the value of my property and the services that I consume. Not just simply make yourself feel good. The unfortunate part of the living wage status is that it's a heartfelt issue where people get on their social soapboxes and feel good about things. We are going through the exact same thing in the province of Ontario with the raising of minimum wages. Employers, individuals are compelled to meet those standards, and they will. And each time a wage standard is established, there needs to be a return. You will find, if you haven't started into it now, you will experience that employers will be engaged in performance reviews. Now, is that telling me I'm up? I got a minute? That's telling me I got a minute.
That tells you that you have a minute, yes.
Okay, that's good. I catch on fairly quickly. So when there are issues brought forward, I expect that anytime there are changes to be made, policies to be adopted and adapted, it will be directed towards the ratepayer. Not the consumer, the ratepayer. Not the beneficiary, the ratepayer. I expect that there are metrics on all of this. I think one of the things that when asked originally, what would you eliminate? What would you reduce? I don't recall who the individuals were, but I do know that they were staff and they were politicians. My concern was, and is, how does it get to be as high as it is? I do not for the life of me understand why or how you can explain anything other than the equivalent of a consumer price index increase. That would be about 1.7%, according to the latest numbers that are published in this, that I see here. Whether or not that's an accurate reflection is another thing. If I go over, tell me, because I'll keep going until you tell me to stop.
I'll let you know.
And in summary, there are other things that I found to be preposterous. That we're prepared to do 3-year forward budgeting, but we're not prepared to do 3-year forward rate setting. So in between, we'll adopt things that cause costs to increase. When it comes to objective setting and labor bargaining, clearly council and the city wasn't on top of it. And there are times things get away, but they shouldn't get away consistently and constantly. I know, and we all know, that on certain collective bargaining issues, the ability to pay is deemed a non-consideration by our labor relations environment. And
Mr. Milady, I'm going to ask you if you could just summarize for us now, please.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think that you folks need to sharpen your pencils. I know that you need to achieve 1.7%. My understanding of this process is that it's to get to that objective. And I want to finish up with my last comment goes to my first comment, and that is that when I went to the meeting, it was to learn how does this get to be as high as it is. And when the first question to me was, what would you cut? I found that to be an insult to me and to the process. And I don't know that it was intended to be, but that's the way I took it. The insult is, I don't think there is a person in here who makes a proposal that carries excess in it. I do understand that there are vested interests, and I hope that the interests that you vest and pursue are the taxpayer and ratepayer, not other social, political, individual initiatives. I wish you well. I look forward to paying 1.7% and only 1.7% more. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Milady. I can assure you that this committee will work diligently to reduce the tax rate from what it is, because we always take into consideration who pays the bill at the end of the day.
Well, I'm glad to hear that today, because I didn't hear it the other day.
Thank you. And now we'll call on Mr. Fairweather to do the overview of the sewer and water.
Thank you. Through the chair to the committee, I'm going to present an overview briefly of the water and wastewater budget. At the end, we can take questions on the presentation and then get into discussions around the water and wastewater budget. The budget before you today is going to cover the 2018 to 2020 budget. The 2018 budget is 100% supported by user rates. As Mr. Dyken indicated, the city's not allowed to cross-subsidize between water and wastewater budgets with the operating budget. 2018-2019 financial information was developed by staff with a starting point of 5.53 and 6.19, which were the rates that were previously approved in the 2017 budget forecast. Excuse me, the water and sewer budget results in a combined water and wastewater rate increase of 3.3, with an average household impact of $35.59 based on 204 cubic meters. The rate increase for the water and wastewater is consistent with the rate increase identified in the long-range plan. The long-range plan had identified just a little over 6% a year for 10 years, so the rates are down. And the 2019 and 2020 are expected to be 4.05 and 4.38. The chart here outlines the starting points of where we started and where we're proposing. You'll see we started at 5.52 in 2018 was the forecasted rate. We're at 3.33. A lot of the reduction there is a result of work that's been done on the I&I and on the water loss containments. It's allowed us to reduce the overall increase there. And that's flowing into 2019 and 2020. There was no forecast. We're at 4.38. The 3-year rates are well below what was previously approved by council within the 5-year rate study. Savings were realized on the reduction, as I've talked about, due to the water loss and the distribution, work that's been done on the I&I, which is the inflow and infiltration within the sanitary lines, reduced operating costs due to preventative maintenance efforts, and decreased emergency repairs. So as the network's getting tighter, the emergency repairs are decreasing. These decreases have no impact on the service level in the water and wastewater. Service levels are remaining at the same as they previously were in 2017. The next chart here highlights the budget. Overall budget for water and wastewater is estimated to be $65.9 million. A major portion of that, or 31%, or $20.5 million, is the acquisition of the water and the sewer treatment from the region. So the sewer treatment is 16.1. So the two combined numbers, the 31 and the 24, represent what the city acquires from the region for wastewater treatment and for water purchases. The next number of 10% is our program supplies, $6.7 million. There's a contribution to capital, which is the money that's used to sustain the infrastructure, is $8.7 million. Salary and benefits, $5.4 million, which is 8%. Contribution to revenue fund, again, because their services provided by the revenue fund, they're able to be recovered back from the water and wastewater budgets, and that totals off to $5 million, or 8%. There's some other minor expenditures of 1.8. There's debt servicing costs for the debt that's been issued for water projects, $1 million, and contract services of $700,000. If we look at the water and wastewater budget, like the operating budget, there is impacts that come from capital projects. So in 2017, the impacts on water anticipated through capital projects is $105.9 thousand. That is mainly debt servicing costs for repairs that are being done within the network. The $12,000 is for the East Side Lands pumping station, which is a new pumping station. So there's operating costs that come in with the operations of a pumping station of $12,000. There's another pumping station for the East Side Lands in 2018 for $68,000, and there's some various other expanded services and networks within the operating for water and sewer in 2020 for $88,000. If we look at the water and wastewater budget, the combined impact from the operating, which we'll talk about later, is $79.87. Water's $35.59 for a total of about $115,000. It's about a $9.62 increase overall for the operations. And with that, I'll open up for questions before we get into the review.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr. Fairweather in relation to the water and sewer budget? Councillor Devine.
Yeah, Mr. Fairweather, how much have we decreased the water loss?
The water loss, I believe, has dropped by over 1% this year from last year.
Okay. The wages and benefits, 5.4 million. How many people do we have in there?
I'd have to look. I think it's approximately 70 people between the water and wastewater programs.
Okay, now the other thing I've noticed here is the salaries and benefits. There's an increase of 7% for the 2018 budget. Employees receive 2% increase. Why are we at 7%?
There is also $1.25 per hour on top of the 2%.
Okay.
So that's why the increase is there.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Just before we move on, I think Mr. Brownberg has a further explanation in relation to the water. Mr. Brownberg?
Through the chair, to respond to Councillor Devine, the water loss initially was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25%, and the latest numbers indicate we're at about 19.5%. Mr. Fairweather indicated that's another 1% reduction, but that was another 1% reduction from where we were last year at around 20.5%, just for clarification.
With that, I'll turn it over to the committee for discussions.
Any other questions of Mr. Fairweather? And for discussion now. Any discussion in relation to the sewer and water budget? So we're proposing an increase of $35.59 on an annual basis to the ratepayer for water and sewer. George?
Okay. Honorable Chairman, are we passing this thing now? Are we going to get an opportunity to make our own presentations, or where can I kind of step in and have comments that I've sort of delved out of the meetings that I've attended so far?
George, right now would be a great time in relation to sewer and water. The proposal would be to try and pass it, but we're not going to pass it until we have discussed it. And if you have questions or concerns or comments that you want to make, this is the time. This is the time to do it. Please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Again, there was Councillor Devine mentioned something about the salaries increasing by 7%. And listening to Patrick Milady, who was just here, who was a taxpayer, who was here just a few minutes ago, in his comments, I'd like to make these following comments. I did try to attend the Hespeler Roadshow, but it was canceled the night that I could attend that it was originally set up. And I'm looking at things, and I look at it as an overview. I think we need to find an increase that taxpayers can live with. What I hear Mr. Milady saying, he can't seem to live with a 5-point-something increase. We know that the CPI is 1.7. We know that the municipal price index is around that figure too. I think the way this budget comes together, it's been formed by the staff and just kind of thrown at council and anybody else and the taxpayers. And I think what the budget should be looked at, they've got to look at a different view. They've got to say, what's happening out in the street? How do we compare to our other cities? Why are our increases higher than Kitchener, Waterloo, and Guelph? I mean, where does this stand? I mean, I look at our financial statements, and we saved $3.4 million from our budget last year. We saved that. We increased the net assets of the city's financials by over 2%. And we're going around, all the departments have said, hey, we want increases. In some increases, they're not talking about 1.7%, they're talking bigger increases. What we have to try to do is focus in on the taxpayer. And we know what the feelings are out on the streets. We know that there's changes coming to wages in this province. I know there's going to be people going to be laid off from work because of cutbacks just to try to survive the game we're in out in the streets. And I'm going to tell you, it's incomprehensible that a budget, would be proposed to the public at a rate that's like 5 point or 6 points increase year over year, especially when we look what we've done in the past. We look at where the cities benefited themselves, and I think there has to be a change of view. And I could get into the specifics. I won't particularly at this point, but I've gone through all the departments for what I had. There's a lot of stuff to go through. There really is. It's amazing. But I think we have to refocus. The budget has to be refocused on what is happening out in the streets, and deal with that accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shepsley. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Mr. Dyke to answer the questions, and we're going to deal specifically with the water sewer part of that. And one of the things that I think is important to state, we as a council can be held personally liable for the condition of the water. So one of the things that we as council have to do is make sure that water is never compromised, simply because of the disasters that occurred years ago in Walkerton, for example. So that's one thing that we have to make sure that we stand by, and I know every councillor would agree with me on that we can never undermine the water that we get. But as far as the comments in relation to the water and sewer, I'm going to get Mr. Dyke to speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think to Mr. Shepsky's comments, a lot of them I would interpret are generally geared more towards the operating budget than the water and wastewater budget, because in the water wastewater budget, it's purely driven by the rates we charge for the consumption of the water and the treatment of the sanitary sewer. And on that front, as both Mr. Fairweather and Mr. Bromberg pointed out, is we've actually done exactly what you're asking with respect to that budget, whereby through internal operational changes and efficiency, we've actually started to pull back and decrease what the projected rate increases were going to be over time. So that's occurring now. I believe that we're about 1% lower than was originally projected for the water rate going into 2018. So we're doing that. With respect to, I think the balance of your comments pertain directly to the operating budget, and with your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, I'll put some context to some of the people. You're quite correct in with respect to how the budget is reported out, and we struggle with this every year. We struggle with the comparisons to our adjacent municipalities, be it Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph in particular. But I think one of the things from our perspective is how it's presented. Guelph, for example, they came in, they showed a number around 2% for their rate increase. But if they actually got a little deeper into the press release, Guelph took 3 separate budget reports to their committee. And when you add them all up, their actual rate increase is around the 5% mark. Okay? We don't do that. We actually bring forward the complete budget going forward, which identifies your capital, your operating, all factors put in place, so you're getting total impact on a household. So bear that in mind when you're comparing to Guelph, because Guelph tax increase is greater than the 2% they put in the paper. It's almost 5%. Waterloo is the same way, and Kitchener's the same way with respect to both those municipalities have a stormwater management fee, which is paid for by the individual over and above their tax rate. We currently include almost $2 million within the operating budget that covers the stormwater management cost to the city. We could excise that $2 million or 1.8, whichever the number is, out of the budget and decrease, but we'd be putting that value back on the ratepayer through a separate fee charge. So it's a lot of it's mechanics, how it's done, and that's why it's very difficult to compare municipality to municipality without fully studying how each of them are reporting out in their budget. The norm for a lot of municipalities is to separate a lot of their budget components and deal with them individually, and you get what would appear to be a lower rate. When you do the aggregate number, it's roughly around where we are. It's not to say we're not very diligent in trying to find efficiencies and effectiveness wherever we can, but on that one specific comment, the comparisons between Waterloo and Guelph are a bit, it's not an apples to apples comparison. With respect to our budget, we're in relationship to the MPI, which is notwithstanding the delegation's comments, is we don't use the standard CPI because the primary source of the goods that we consume, because we're like any other business, we consume goods as well, and we have to pay for things, outstrips the CPI components, and that's where the MPI comes from. And so that's how we put our basis forward. But if you look at also when you're combining what we're paying in capital investments, what we're paying in our operating costs, the actual, if you read in your budget book, our actual operating costs for the city, the increase is 2.8%, and probably with some things we've looked at since the last roadshow, we're probably plus or minus 2.5% on the actual operating increase to the municipality, which is quite close to the 2.01 municipal price index we have, and that's taking into account our labor contract costs that were greater than we anticipated going into it. And again, that's just the nature of negotiations. I mean, is what we came up with. So from an operational standpoint for the budget, I agree with 100%. We need to look at it on the complete impact on the ratepayer, and I think we've done that. Council has made some strong investment choices for the community with respect to make our community better. Some of them, the benefit may not be seen for 2 or 3 years down the road, but they will be received. And I'll go back to one of the comments I made at the roadshow, unfortunately, Mr. Shepsky, and it was in Hessler, with respect to the competitiveness of your municipality. If we don't continue to invest in our municipality, if we don't continue to create an environment where we're competitive, and we need to be competitive. We need to be competitive to retain industry. You need to be competitive to grow industry. You need to be competitive to attract industry. And that's what these budgets are representative of creating that investment to allow that to occur. And so I understand your point, and we do work in that way. But I think hopefully as we go through this process today and maybe into the second day, through your questions, we can explain that in a little greater detail to give you a little bit of comfort level as to how we put this together, because we honestly didn't just throw it at the public.
Mr. Dyke, if I can respond to that. Again, I look at the financial statements, which I hadn't seen before, but fortunately this time I had seen them. When I see that we saved over $3.4 million in our overall expenditures, when I see that we added $16 million to the net worth of the financial statements, or the net assets, if you want to call it, of this city, the book value of the city. When I see we added that, which is over 2%, and then we want to go to the taxpayer and say, holy cow, guys, hey, here's our expenses. You know, we had labor costs and other things that came along, but we want more money. I can understand if we lost money. I mean, if we didn't hit our budgets, we were way over, we're losing asset value, but we're going the other way. And come on, just look at, like, I'm a numbers guy. You know, I practice numbers every day. I deal with 400 different companies in this town, and I know what it takes to try to make some money and try to get ahead and just try to survive. And you're not giving that example to the average taxpayer. And the people like Mr. Milady, who made his presentation. And we need more people like that to come and make that presentation. That needs to be explained. I mean, it really does. I mean, I don't know what the city of, I haven't seen the city of Waterloo's or Guelph's numbers. I just look at the numbers that are in front of us here. I haven't talked to those people. I haven't talked to their staff to understand how they prepared a budget. But it appears to me that what we're looking at, we're going at it at a different point of view here. And the point of view is we should be looking at to make sure that we try to achieve, 1.7 or 2%, because that's what everybody has to live with out in the street. And that's what should be our goal. And if we can't make that goal, then the city has to, within staff, bite the bullet and find out how to do it. Plain and simple. Sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Shepsky. And I'm going to get Mr. Dyke just to further explain on that, and then we're going to try and work our way back to water and sewer.
I think just I think we could have this conversation for a number of hours, George. But I think from our perspective, you look at from what I said, my explanation is with the operation of the city, we did exactly what you're talking about. We're 2.5% increase over last year. The $3 million in savings you talk about, you have to take into account where those savings occurred. If they occurred through an anomaly, if they occurred through just a purely beneficial piece to the municipality, to eliminate that $3 million from our budget would be counterproductive to the budget because you're going to increase that cost anyways. Prime example is winter events. If you're saving money on non-winter, you're not having a big winter, to eliminate that money from your budget would be counterproductive because you're going to get a winter. We live in Canada, you're going to get a winter at some point. And again, we had other things that happened during 2017 that were anomalous to the sense they're not going to happen again. That saved us some money. So it's about what we do with the surplus. Yes, I mean, there are times that we do take the surplus and put it against any potential tax increase, but there are some times, because of an anomaly, that we have to maintain that certain level of pay to accommodate going in next year without eliminating either a deficit or having to increase the budget again. So I think from that standpoint, with respect to, and I come back to the 2.8, we're on 2.5% operating wise, which I'm quite comfortable with respect to what the MPI is. With respect to what the rest of the increase is, those are capital investments, wise capital investments that this municipality has made to ensure ourselves going forward. And as you can appreciate in the work that you do for your private clients, is that there are points in time where any given year, or in a given year, you have to make a capital investment into your business to keep it competitive or allow it to grow. And that will have some kind of impact on your financial statements for that given year. And that's what we're experiencing this year. We've done a very good job in keeping our operating budget within what I think is a well planned out the MPI, but we've made some strategic capital investments in the community that are necessary that have created that factor this year. And so with respect to the chairman, going back to the wastewater budget, that's how we looked at this budget. And to be point, we made those comments last year during the 2017 budget deliberations as well.
So what I'll do is I think we need to hold on to that point though, Mr. Shepsky. I think that needs to come back up as we go back into the operating budget. I don't want to lose that, but I do want to look at the sewer, wastewater, and water, and see where we can go with that. Are there any other questions in relation to the sewer and water? Councillor Amata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick comment, if I may. I just wanted to say with this water budget, I would be concerned about cuts just because I don't want to be personally held liable or sued. I don't like the increase, but safety is paramount. And this is one thing that I wouldn't want to cut because I don't want to risk another Walkerton. If I can have evidence that there are ways to do it without compromising the safety, I would back that. But I haven't been convinced at this time. So that's where I'm coming from with this budget. But the other two, I'm certainly willing to go through and look at cuts for those ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Devine.
Yes. Gary, you gave an explanation about the City of Kitchener with their wastewater management. But do we have any comparators to any other municipalities when it comes to water and wastewater? Because we have no comparators here.
Yeah, we do have, through, sorry, Mr. Chairman, through to Councillor Devine, we participate through the BMA study, and they evaluate municipalities across the province when they talk water and sewage. We have that information that we can make available to the members of the committee, and we can put on our webpage for information for the public as well, if you like.
I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the comparators between other municipalities, the rate increase
Thank you.
Here as opposed to other municipalities. Okay. I'd like to see those comparators. Thank you.
Just on Councillor Devine's comment there, is that something that we can see later on today or Thursday?
I think we'd have this afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
That's great, thanks. And if there are no other questions, I do have one of Mr. Fairweather, and that's just in relation to the 6% salary and benefits. And I wonder if you could just explain that again. We saw the 6% increase as far as salary and benefits are concerned. Can you just further explain that for us?
The budgets, when we built the budget for water and sewer, we had built in a 1.5% basically COLA adjustment. The collective agreements were a 2% COLA adjustment. Plus, within the 32 bargaining group, there was also an adjustment of $1.25 per hour. That alone is about a $500,000 to $600,000 cost just for the $1.25 adjustment that wasn't previously in the budget.
Mr. Chairman, just to further comment on that, that was part of the, that was a job evaluation number with respect to the length of time it had been since the jobs within 32 had been reevaluated into market conditions, and that's where that result came from.
Thank you. Sure. So I'll get right to you, Councillor, but through that job evaluation, that's mandated by the province, correct? The job evaluation, pay equity? Thank you. Councillor Devine.
Yeah, just a question on that job evaluation. I understand there was some pickup at the collective bargaining. Is the job evaluation process completed now, or is it still ongoing? And could it impact the budget in the future?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, if I could defer to Mr. Bush to comment on that, please.
Job evaluation is an annual process. It should happen every year, so it can impact the budget. The job evaluation for QP 32 has not taken place yet.
That's a good question.
Thank you. Mayor Craig.
Just a quick question. Talking about stormwater runoff that the other municipalities in fact, do it in a different way. What would be the impact on our budget percent-wise if, in fact, we did send out monthly bills to everybody, somewhat the same as Kitchener and Waterloo? Because I think that should be our starting point. It shouldn't be 5.78. But anyways, can you bring that sort of roughly?
I believe the charge right now is about $12 a household that we charge on an annual basis for stormwater management. If you were to take that out and compare that to, say, Guelph, I think Guelph last year brought in $4 a month, so it's $48 a year for stormwater management. Our cost, though, there's some work that still needs to be done to refine the cost and to make sure it's reflective of the true sustainability of the network. But it'd be about $12 a household, which
what would
is
that
about
be?
1%.
1%?
Yeah.
So you take 1% off the budget, we could look at it that way?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Any other questions? I know Mr. Dyke wants to make some clarifying points. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that would be 1% off operating costs. So for a true representation of what that impact that would be, where I mentioned we're around the 2.5% mark operating increase, that would come off that number. So our operating cost would drop to 1.5, which would be below the CPI.
And are there any other comments in relation to the sewer and water? I think, Mr. Fairweather, did you want that passed this morning? Are we prepared to pass just that portion of the budget, the sewer and the water portion of the budget. I know that makes a big difference on getting that done. Moved by Mayor Craig. Do I have a seconder?
Mr. Chair, I would like to see the comparators before we pass this.
Okay, I don't have a seconder.
Well, that's fine.
So why don't we?
In about 20 years that's happened. But go ahead.
Okay, so for
I
the
have a
moment,
question.
and I'm going to get to you, Councillor Reid. So right now we have Councillor Devine saying he'd like to see the comparators. Councillor Reid?
Yes, I'm just wondering if we can present it to the public in a different way if we pass it today. If we can present it so that the public is more aware of the fact that it affects the operating budget and that would come below, or is that not possible because we put it within our rate so that they pay differently than other areas?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. It would be difficult because it would be an estimate we'd be presenting because we haven't broken it out in the same fashion. With respect to going forward, just from a process standpoint, is that this committee is recommending to council, so anything that goes forward would still be subject to final approval of council before it would actually become final. And that's the purpose of the committee's recommendations on the budget. We will endeavor to, as we move forward, we'll get the comparator rates in as well, and we'll do our best to explain how they, similar to the tax base, how they're impacted by each municipality, because the increases will be different depending on the program, and that's one of the things that it was. Not an issue, but one thing to remember with Cambridge being ahead of the curve with respect to the asset management and the water and the sewer pieces, we were one of the leading municipalities respected, putting the plan together to do the proactive and preventative maintenance within our water and sewer infrastructure to keep a stable rate across time without getting massive spikes and to eliminate failures, which cause the greatest impact on the increases. So that was part of it, as well as to where we had a period in Cambridge where our rates seemed to be increasing greater than other municipalities, but with respect to it, our infrastructure was in a much more stable rate, so we were lower risk of failure and lower risk of the need for any great spike within the rate to accommodate a failure or a catastrophic breakdown within our system. So those are the two things come to mind. So, and that's where our rates came from, was a 10-year plan that was brought forward to council, I believe, 7 years ago.
I'm going to beat this to death. I'm going to ask if there are any more questions in relation to sewer and water. And if there aren't, then we're going to put that on hold, and we'll see if we can get those comparator rates. And before we move on, Councillor Amata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just thought of a question this time. How much has the region increased their water? Because we buy the water from the region, right? What percentage is that? Or if you can get that later, that would be good.
Mr. Dyke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think for the benefit of the committee going forward, I think maybe advantageous for this afternoon when we bring the comparators back is that we can have Mr. Austin attend the meeting, and he can walk council through to Councillor Amata's comments with respect to what the money is doing with respect to the rate increases and what the long-term plan is for the infrastructure piece of the water and sewer budget. So, Mr. Bromberg, could I ask you to have Mr. Austin here this afternoon?
Okay, then what we'll do now is we've got some direction to staff for later this afternoon in relation to water and sewer, and I'll ask Mr. Dyke to move forward with the capital budget.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, I'll defer to Mr. Fairweather.
Thank you. I'll give you a brief overview of the 2018 to 27 capital budget. The city, in developing our budget, we use a prioritization model. We've been using that for several years now, and we rank all capital projects, so they're all competing for funding on it. We do the ranking based on the 9 criteria, which is the project category, alignment with corporate strategic direction, operating budget impact, risk assessment, cost benefit or payback, service levels, infrastructure impact, community impact, and economic development. The development charge projects that are contained within the capital budget are based on the development charge study from 2014. You'll see in here that we're estimating about $9.7 million, which is coming out of the capital levy and some of the gas tax funding. You'll see in there that the infrastructure planning is about $0.15 million, IT infrastructure 1.32 or 13%. The library funding is 0.27 or 3% of the capital. Maintenance and rehabilitation is 1.07 or 34 or 11%. New facility expansion is 3.34 or 34%. We have other of 0.27 million or 3%. 28% is for roads, storm, bridges, and construction, 2.73 million. Trails is 5% or 0.51 million. In transportation network is 0.7 or 1%. In here, the 2018 capital budget is about $20.2 million in projects, and if we split those out into the categories, you have capital levy based of $5.9 million, 29%. Development charges comes in at 2% or $0.3 million. Reserve funds, 9.5 or 47% of the capital budget. Gas tax, $3.9 million or 19%. Grants, $0.4 million, 2% of the spend, or other funding of $0.2 million or less than 1%. Again, with the capital budget, the total 10-year capital budget is $432.5 million, and I just went through that on the other slide there for you. So it's broken down into the various funding categories there. If we look at the draft operating impacts that are coming out of the capital, the list here lists it by project, and you'll see that the first major impact is the Fire Station 6 operating costs, which are being phased in over a 5-year period. So 1.3 in 18, a little over almost 1.1 in 19, and 400,000 in 2020. The other smaller amounts there are for IT services, which is basically our services, and those would be our software licensing costs related to that. The other major one on 2018 is the Integrated Computer Aid Dispatcher CAD system for fire, and with that there's a potential for 3 FTEs being added over the 3-year program there. So that total for corporate services is about $1.6 million. The next page, we have the LED street lighting, which is the debenture payments for the street lighting there of $285,800. The other projects there are all debt-related financing costs in future years there. Also, we have community development with Back to the River. The LED street lighting does have savings, and there is a potential for a further adjustment to realize further savings of about $245,000, which we'll talk more about in the operating budget. There's some camera enforcement stuff and some energy management savings through relamping at the various things. There's a land acquisition that's anticipated in 18, which will have an operating budget impact in 19, and there's some cemetery improvements in future years. The library, we have the historic post office, which has a partially opening in 18 and the remainder in 19. So if you look at the total of the operating budget impacts in 2018 is about $2.1 million, of which about 1.9 is in relation to the CAD system, the library, and the fire station, leaving 224 from other projects. And if you adjust that for the potential adjustment for further savings from the LED, there's about a $20,000 overall savings in the operating budget impacts from 2018. The amounts that are here for water and wastewater, most of these are in the water area related to debt financing for expansion of projects there. The other amounts in future years are related to expansion of the network through the capital projects related to some of the expansion of our growth development areas. If we look at the 10-year forecast, the red indicates what we had requests for that we couldn't fit within the funding envelope, and the blue is what is actually contained within the capital budget. This isn't unusual. We get more requests usually every year and what we can accommodate within the capital budget. We just wanted to give council an idea of how that's trending for them. The next slide here shows the city's overall infrastructure gap, and you'll see that it's a little over $140 million currently. We pay attention to this to see whether the infrastructure gap of projects needing repairs that we can't fund, where it sits in relation to the overall funding. And it's high, but it's not as high as it has been in the past, and we have made some headway on reducing and managing the infrastructure gap. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions on the capital budget before you do your detailed review of it.
Thank you, Mr. Fairweather. And I just would ask that you go back and maybe explain, you said that, was it 2.1 million in operating expenses in the capital were associated to the library, the CAD, and the fire department?
Yeah, if you go back to the slide here, and I'll just take you back, the 18, there's $1.3 million relating to Station 6. And then there's 167,000 further down for the CAD system. Plus, if you go look at the opening of the library, about 396 or 400,000. The total of those make up the majority of the $2.1 million in capital impacts from to operating.
Great, thank you. And so with that, are there any questions in relation to the capital budget for 2018 that Mr. Fairweather has spoken to? Councillor Reid.
Yes, do we have a copy of what you just presented?
This presentation?
Yes.
Yes, we can get one too. I can email that out to
I find it,
all members.
I'm a visual person.
Yep.
I need to see it.
Sure.
Thanks.
Other questions? Mr. Schlepsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have the, the figures that we have, the financial figures for 2017 in front of me. But I know that we had surpluses coming that we've done in the past 2 years that I've seen. I don't know what the current interim figures are, but if we have surpluses that we gather up through grants and other things that we do, why can't we use some of these surpluses that we've accumulated in the past to offset some of this capital budget that we have going forward? Why can't we use? We've grown. We have more assets that we have at our disposal, but we're still asking for more money from the public, and I just can't understand the logic of it. I'm sorry. Thank you.
I'll get Mr. Dyke to address that, and then Mr. Fairweather.
Just on a high level piece, we do that. I mean, we do reinvest any surplus we have with respect to capital spending goes back into the capital reserve, and which is, you see in the breakdown in the sheets as to the funding sources from the projects. The capital reserve is a big piece of that, and so any surplus we take in a capital expenditure or a given year goes back into that reserve, which is then used to offset a capital project in future budgets. So we do that. We do, and obviously with respect to some of the, as you can tell, if you eliminate the large project, which is I spoke of before, which is the investment piece of it, we are quite low with respect to what is the operating impact from capital with respect to the manner in which we do it. But I'll ask Mr. Fairweather to speak specifically to the numbers.
So the impacts that are brought across from capital are going into the operating budget. As Mr. Dyke has alluded to, if the capital project comes in under budget, whatever the funding source is, the surplus funds from that project are returned back to the reserve or reserve fund that the project was funded through. So if we're building a project that's development charge related funding, those funds go back to the development charge related reserve funds. We're not allowed to take money out of the specific reserve funds. They're earmarked for a specific purpose, so they go back in there. As for the operating impacts, they flow in. The financial statements are done on a different basis than the budget is performed on. The financial statements are done based on what we call an accrual basis of accounting, whereas the budget is done based on a cash basis of accounting. So there's a big difference between the two. And if you look at the financial statements, The number you're referring to is surplus. You have to look at the underlying cause of the surplus. In 2016, I believe we received about $16 million worth of donated assets, which we have to recognize as revenue into the corporation, as opposed to, it's not a revenue stream for us. We're taking on basically a liability of the infrastructure that we're taking over from developers. So those are our water, sewer, roads, street lights, sidewalks, all of those things that the developer builds. Once he's done a subdivision, it becomes taxable. The city inherits all the operating costs and the capital replacement for those. So the statements that you're looking at are done on a different basis than what we do for budget purposes. So,
Mr. Fairweather, again, looking at that, look at the previous year. In 2015, we took on other things like that, donated things. The budget doesn't reflect any problems with it. I look at it this way, and I'm going to put it in real simple terms. This is like an $800,000 house, okay? It's got debt-free, it's got equity in here of $640,000 on your $800,000 house. We've got lots of equity, we've got lots of value here. We don't have to go, if we're going to have to go out to the public and ask for extra dollars, I think when we have an equity base, we could borrow the money to do the capital expenditure or something, but I don't buy this cash basis and the other stuff because it all has to relate to what is at the end of the day. And I look at our financials, and I don't think we are looking at the financials as a financial person would. We're just not doing that. We're missing the boat. Sorry. Thank you.
just to make a comment back to that, the city operates under what's called the Municipal Act. Within the Municipal Act, we're defined as to what we can and cannot debenture for, and the fact that we cannot run a deficit within a budget year. So we're unable to run a deficit. What you're referring to, in order to realize that, we'd have to sell off our assets and lease them back. What you're referring us to do is, because we've got investments in community center, road network, transportation, all the other things, is there's a heavy capital investment in that asset. Yes, unlike a business, we don't lever our assets by going into debt to refinance what we've already paid for. So there's a big difference on looking at a commercial versus a municipal or government sector of operations.
Mr. Fairweather, but we do have debt. We actually took on more debt this year over the previous year. And so we have a process of doing that. So it's a matter of, when we have a process of doing that, why aren't we doing it for some of these other things too? We can, I just don't follow the theory. I'm sorry, I don't. Because I look at our financials, I see what we have, I see the value we have, and I equate it strictly to a household, and it's very easy to equate it to a household. To be really simple. And I think we're missing the boat just a little bit on that. Sorry.
The debt that we have been issuing is not for rehabilitation or replacement. The debt we've been issuing is for expansion of services. So unlike a household, we don't have a revolving line of credit. Any debt that we issue must be issued and paid off over a specified term at the end of the debt on it. So I mean, it's not as simple as looking at the operations of a household in comparison to the operations of a municipality or a government enterprise.
I think Mr. Dyke has some further comments that he wants to add to that.
I think it's you're correct. We do a multitude of different ways of which we pay for our capital investments, and debt is one of them. And we have taken on debt for a number of our larger projects. But even if we were to borrow against, say, the development charges account, or borrow against the cash in lieu of parkland account, we still have to pay it back, and we have to pay it back. So it's going to impact the operating budget no matter which way you do it, right? So what Mr. Fairweather is saying is the manner in which we do it. And if you look at the magnitude of the investment we're putting into our community, we've done a very good job with respect to how that's balanced out. It's just with the exception of the major capital investments, of which there is one that is directly impacting 2018 budget, which in any industry, be it private, be it public, you're going to get those years where you have to do an influx of capital into your operation to keep yourself viable. Well, that's 2018 for us. And we have another part of it in 2019 as well to keep ourselves viable and competitive. So we are following, and with respect, you're probably not going to find a more financially minded person than Mr. Fairweather. in how he handles our finances. And with respect to that, that's just where we're at right now. We're in an investment period for our municipality, and we've reflected that by how we've modified our operating budget. Again, is we pulled over $1.5 million out of our operating budget. We've actually reinvested and decreased our staff complement within the operations of the municipality to be more efficient with respect to going forward. So everything we're doing is reflective of the impact of what's happening. And as I'm forgetting the numbers, Stephen, but right off the top is that you're looking at $1.3 million just specific to one project, which we are debt financing, and I believe there's some development charges involved in that one as well. But we are doing exactly what you're talking about, just within the confines of municipal operations. And we're not leveraging an asset for more money. We're borrowing for specific projects and pay them back over 15, I think some are 30-year projects. So we're not, I think that's where we're at right now with it, and I'm quite comfortable with the manner with which we present it to council. So that's really all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Shepsky.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Back to Mr. Dyke again. Again, if we're going to go out to the public and say, Mr. Taxpayer, part of our capital expenditure here, we want you to pay for this year. And it's something that's going to benefit us for 30-some years. Why don't we just incur the debt, like we have incurred other debts in the past, in order to try to save the taxpayer part of that for this particular tax year? I mean, amortize it over the 30 years or whatever the life of the project is, and fund it that way. This way, again, we're trying to stay within the CPI, the MPI overall for our tax increase, and things like this that we could do in a different way that needs to be looked at.
Mr. Chairman, through to Mr. Shepsky, that's exactly how we did it. We debt financed. What you're seeing, we're reflected in the operating budget, are the debt costs of that project, right? We have to pay the debt back, so we have to build in whatever that payment is, the loan payment for lack of a better term is that's what's reflected in the impact operating off our debt. We did take debt on, we did borrow. We're not taking 100% of the cost of the project and dumping it straight into the tax base. What you're seeing reflected in there is the financial cost of the investment going forward. Also, what you're seeing in there is, with respect to, again, a municipality versus the house, is with respect to, whereas you could make a proportionate investment in an $800,000 house that we're making in Fire Station 6, doesn't mean you're putting extra people in your house. We're investing in Fire Station 6 for the growth and improvement of our community. With that comes, we have to staff Station 6. So that's part of the operating impact as well. So it's not as simple as saying you're going to invest and put this money in. We also have to build it and we have to operate it. And so what you're getting is a combination of both the financing charges and the operational charges of Station 6. So the analogy of the house breaks down at that point. It's okay when you're talking about straight capital investment. When you're dealing on operating impacts is a proportionate, as I can repeat myself, a proportionate investment in an $800,000 house. You don't have an increase of people in your house because you put $200,000 of investment into your house. So what you're talking about with respect to taking on debt, we have done that, and that's reflected in that $1.3 million number.
Mr. Chairman, again, Mr. Dyke, we increased our debt by about $5 million. We had a surplus overall of $16 million. When I look at that, I'm saying, come on, folks. Sure, we took on debt, but we've got a surplus. We had a surplus the year before of $17 million. Surely we can look at the financials and say, hey, we could do something a little smarter for the taxpayer of the streets. And so the debt that we took off is far offset by the surplus that we've taken on. So come on, let's just, where's the common sense?
Well,
I don't fall, I'm sorry.
With respect to Shepsky, there is a lot of common sense that goes into this budget. Okay?
I'm sure.
I mean, I think to be fair, this budget was very well put together. With respect to your comment on the $60 million surplus, as Mr. Fairweather has already explained, that $60 million is reflective of assets taken on by the municipality, which are basically donated assets in roads, sanitary, and water. It's not an influx of cash. It's an influx of actual assets that we assume through our development agreements with developers. So we're getting $60 million takes in roads, water, and sewer. Right? So it's not money. It's not cash coming in.
Again, Mr. Councillor and Mr. Dyke, it doesn't have to be cash. It can be just value. I mean, it's value that we've got, and it's value that we can leverage, and it's value we can show to when we compare municipalities' statements from one to another. It is value, and so it needs to be considered in the big picture. So thank you.
So thank you for those. That's good. We need that dialogue so that we can understand that, because if we have $16 million in assets that we can't turn into cash, it's hard to draw on that and put into the budget. I'm going to suggest that Mr. Shepsky and Mr. Fairweather and Mr. Dyke can discuss this a little more if they like. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we're going to reconvene at 10:35. So we'll be back at 10:35, folks. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think that was a good discussion we had earlier. And before we proceed, we're going to go back to the water and sewer. I think Mr. Fairweather has the updates from the region, so it will give us some comparators that we were looking for earlier. Mr. Fairweather?
Through the chair to Councillor Mata, he was asking what the rate increases were from the region in regards to the water and wastewater. The regional rate increases for water are 1.9 in 18, 2.9 in 19, 2.9 in 20. Wastewater treatment regional increase rate is 7.9 in 18, 5.9 in 19, and 3.9 in 2020.
And Steve, I think you said that our increase for water and sewer was 3.3% for 2018. Is that correct?
The overall city increase for water in the years 18, 19, and 20 is 3.33 in 18, 4.05 in 19, and 4.38 in 2020.
Okay. With that information, is everybody acceptable to dealing with the water and sewer? I think our rates are more than comparable to the region. And with that information, I'd like to if somebody would be prepared to move a motion to accept the water and sewer portion of the budget. Moved by Mayor Craig, seconder. Councillor Donna Reid. Those in favor? Those opposed? It's carried. So the water and sewer we can put aside, that's dealt with. So we'll go back to the capital. And what we have three major drivers in our capital budget. And the fire station has been approved, the library has been approved, and the CAD, computer-aided dispatch system for the fire service or the fire department, is also in the books for approval. Those are items that if we don't approve the spending, then those buildings sit empty. But those projects have already been approved. So as we look at the capital budget, I think we have to look at what the projects are over the next 10 years, which is what Mr. Fairweather has provided, and we have that document in front of us now. We need to go through that, and are we prepared to accept that as the capital expenditures that we anticipate or that we approve over the next 10 years? So if you want to take the time to look at that document that has been circulated, and then we will review that, and I'll get we'll review that and we'll come back to it in a couple of minutes. I'm going to get Mr. Fairweather to, he's got some other information to put up in relation to capital expenditures, and I'll ask him to go ahead and do that.
Summary.
Just so we're clear on the last motion that was moved, the water and sewer will be increased by 3.33% for 2018. And that will be the recommendation going forward to council.
I'll have a question when it's appropriate, so.
Councillor Amata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I have a question, and I apologize if it's an unfair one. So if time is needed, by all means, you don't have to have it right, you don't have to have the answer right now. You know, so some of the constituents in my ward, they're aware of some of the new buildings that we're opening, such as the library, the fire station. One of the guys had asked me if it's a possibility that we don't staff them for a year or two, and what that could do to the budget. I'm just putting it forward as a question. I'm not doing it as a suggestion, but just to represent my constituents, I'm just putting it forward to get that information. So whether it's today or whether it's whenever, if I could get an answer to take back to them, that would be great. And maybe for all of us here as well.
Absolutely, absolutely a fair question, and I'll get Mr. Dyke to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think through to Councillor Mott, I mean, that is ultimately the decision of this committee, or a recommendation of this committee through to council, and ultimately council's decision is that we have, we budget the money. I think Police Station 6 is 3/4 done from a construction standpoint. If that was the recommendation of the committee, that's a consideration we have, is to not staff Station 6. Could be a recommendation of the committee, with the way the pros and cons of having a building built and sit empty for X number of years. And really all you're doing is pushing the cost out, because you're going to have to staff it at some point. And as you can tell in this one slide just flew by you, it shows that we are incrementally building the total cost of the staffing Station 6 over 3 years. So we've already taken some of that into account now. So, but that is, you know, yeah, in theory, that is an option that this committee and ultimately council can consider, is building the asset and leaving it empty for a number of years.
And sorry, I'm Gary, and through you, Mr. Chair, would that be an option for the library too, or how far along are we? I mean, I love the building, I think it's great, but is there any flexibility to delay that if we have to? I don't know, but.
I guess my comments, sorry, Mr. Chairman, through you, my comments would hold true to any facility we build. Until it's operational. I think the library is scheduled to be open until in March, June, completed in March, open in June. I mean, that's always an option for any facility we build.
So we have the 10-year capital forecast on the screens, and I'll just get Mr. Fairweather to identify some of those ones that have the operating impact in the 2018 budget.
I think one thing we will do is, you have the complete list of, or Debbie has the complete list of the capital projects for 2018. And they're going to be, if you look at the chart, there's a number of areas how they're funded by, and only a small percentage of those projects are actually have operating impacts. So if we're looking at reducing, through capital, reducing the impact on the operating budget, we've identified the projects that have a direct operating impact, and we've talked briefly about how some of those can be impacted. The other way, and by no means take this as an endorsement, the other way it can be done is by not drawing from the capital reserve, which means not doing projects, and not building the capital reserve. I would recommend against that as a means to lower the budget because, as we mentioned, we have a $145 million infrastructure gap now. And this is the only way we build the money up to pay for that work to be done. And that's our critical infrastructure. That's not stuff that is just nice to have. That's critical infrastructure. That's the pipes in the ground. Those are your roads. Those are your bridges or your large culverts, those type of things. So that's what you're looking at here. So if you're looking to directly impact the operating budget, it's going to be limited to that list that has already shown that it has a direct impact to the operating budget.
So as we look at that list, we can look at the operating costs that are involved in each project for 2018. And you can go through that list and look at each project and say, are we going to continue with it or are we not? And that's really what it boils down to. So I'll give you some time to go through that list and take a look at it. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Fairweather for a couple of comments in relation to the operating costs.
Just when you're looking at the project 16C060, which is the LED street lighting, it's broken down into two components on the summary there. There's 285.8, which is an increased cost related to the debt servicing to do the project. And then the LED street lighting down below shows a savings of 179.3. There's an additional 245,001 in savings to be added to that.
Actually a positive.
So it's the cash flow on that is an actual savings on that of about $150,000. Can you scroll down to that, Debbie?
It's the second page. Next one down. Next page.
Keep going down. Right there. So the 285.1 that is there plus the 179.3, the 179.3 needs to be increased by an additional 245.1 in savings. So the net overall savings is about $150,000 in the operating budget for that project.
Now I'm going to open it up for questions on the capital budget. We've had a chance to review the lists, and again, I'm going to open it up for questions in relation to the capital budget. Are there any questions in relation to the capital? Councillor Reid.
Just a clarification of Service Cambridge. What is that?
I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Bush to answer that.
Service Cambridge is our centralized customer service desk downstairs in the main foyer. As you come in on the right-hand side, it was a project that was started a year ago. We're centralizing a one-stop shop for our service for our customers.
Just to add to that, Mr. Chairman, and those costs be reflective of of technology licensing fees?
Yeah, I thought it was that, but good to know for sure.
Mr. Chair?
Councillor Devine.
Yeah, question. 17F060, Amanda Roadmap Implementation, what is that?
We're going to pull up the actual information.
Thank you.
We'll let Debbie take some time to look for that, but I think that's got something to do with the Amanda Weather information system that the IT department's working on. We'll find it.
Amanda is a platform that's used in planning and fire. It's a software system that connects our information for property. And that's just a continuation of that project, an extension of that platform.
Mr. Bromberg?
So, yeah, as Mr. Bush mentioned, the Amanda is the database that bylaw, building, some of our licensing, as well as fire department use, and it's a continuation of our automation towards that.
Thanks. Councillor Devine, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
We'll pull that specific capital sheet up for you, Councillor.
Any other questions in relation to the capital budget? Mr. Shepsky? Any questions in relation to the capital? Thank you. And I'm going to ask for a motion to accept the capital, a recommendation to accept the capital budget. Mr. Price, you look like you have a question.
Just to clarify, you're looking for a motion to accept the 2018 capital projects, not the operating side of the capital. Okay.
Capital.
Thank you.
Yes, just the capital. Moved by Mayor Craig, a seconder. Councillor Reid. Questions? Comments? Those in favor? Those opposed? The recommendation is carried. And the operating impacts on the capital budget will be discussed during the operating budget presentation. So then, sorry, Councillor Amata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a lot of the capital items I'm supportive of in terms of how we finance them, whether we consider purchasing debentures as suggested by George, or whether we look at going into reserves or other alternate methods. Can we still have that conversation later? Not saying I'm going to support that, but is this the time to have that discussion, or can we do that after? I just want to make sure we're following the right process and being fair to you and the staff, and thank you.
This is the time to have that conversation. This is the time. So you want to know how we finance those capital projects?
And then if there's anything that maybe he would like us to look at, we could have that discussion. Because I know he's got some ideas, and I want to make sure that we get them out there, but I want to be mindful of the committee that everyone else can share what they may be thinking as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to turn that over to Mr. Dyke.
Thank you. I think if you call up Debbie, if you can call up the sheet that shows the funding sources for the projects, you have to cross-reference the pieces in, the different pieces. Because sorry, I'm going to make you jump back to the one again. What you're looking at there is now from an operating impact is, so what you're looking at, those pieces are, a lot of times they're going to be the licensing fees associated with a piece of technology. They're going to be either, as we mentioned with Station 6, those are staffing costs for Station 6. That makes up the operating piece of the capital. So if we are going to, so what I'm getting at is that, say there's one, I'm looking at one here now for, just going to get one here, that makes sense. Under, that's a bad example. It was a water one. Street lighting, for example. I mean, that operating expense, that's going to be your hydro costs, that's going to be maintenance costs associated with that new piece of capital. So we don't debt finance operating expenses. Right, so that wouldn't be an applicable way to do it. The impacts you're seeing from capital, those are the cost to operate either a new piece of equipment or the new service we brought in, a new facility brought in. So those are true operating costs, which we wouldn't finance. We don't finance those pieces, if that makes sense.
Mr. Shrepsky.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Again, the only reason I voted against the motion is I further to what Councillor Amara has asked. Why can't we try to, if part of the capital budget is what is going to end up as our total tax increase at the end of the day, why can't we go around and finance part of this? I look at our financial statements. I look at the debt that we have in relation to the asset base that we have. In order to try to mitigate the increase that the taxpayer is going to feel, why can't we find a way to offset some of those costs going forward, so we're hitting not the 5.whatever% we're looking at. We had last year said that we were going to budget a 4.2. That's where we've got to go. If the council has gone ahead and said to the staff, hey, this is what we want you to do, and we don't care how you pay for it, but this is what we want from everybody, then I think council's got to turn around and say, well, wait a minute. The people out in the street can only afford X amount. And on that basis, then what has to happen is we have to have a budget presented to us, or the council has to rethink how the budget is presented in order that we can go out to the public and say, this is a reasonable cost increase. These are the cost increases you're incurring yourself, and this all makes sense. Because right now, the increase that we're looking at is not saleable in relation to the financial statements that are prepared by our external accountants for our city.
Thank you for that, George. And just a couple of things, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dyke for further comment. But I know this committee can make a recommendation to staff. We can say to staff, when we get to the operating budget, we want you to take the budget back. We want you to come back with something that tells us, what does the budget look like at 5%? What does it look like at 4 3/4? What does it look like at 4.5? What does it look like at 4.25? We can ask staff to do that, and they can come back with those particular scenarios, and we can make decisions based on those scenarios. But we know that it will have drastic impacts on what we provide and how we provide it. Again, you've hit the nail on the head when you said that 5.78 is too high. And we've heard that from lots of people, and I think we have a responsibility to look at the budget and see how we can get to a reasonable increase. The other thing is, I know what the financial statements, I know we talk about the $16 million that we have, but it's not hard cash that we have. It's an asset, and we can't borrow against that asset. But I am going to ask Mr. Dyke to comment further on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's, to keep in mind, so we are not legally allowed to borrow money to offset our operating costs. That's full stop. We legally cannot do that. So that's the first piece of it. The aspect of, with respect to dealing with the capital budget and the impact of operating, there are two options, or there's three options. I'll come back to Station 6. It's a bit of a different animal because the capital piece of it is almost done. You can eliminate the project from the list, full stop, and that eliminates the operating impact. Or you can look to modify the project that would decrease the the impact to operating. So if that's where we're going with respect, because I know just looking at some of these, and in fairness to the committee, without mining down into your 6 inches of paper, a lot of these costs, while they're new to the operating budget, are necessary to continue a certain process that we're currently doing. Or an advancement with respect to the technology and of a service we currently provide. So those are the options available to us. We don't have a different way to pay for it. I mean, technically, yes, we could take money out of reserve into our operating, but I got to put it back at some point. The reserve's not infinite, right? So if we have it would actually be, it has been the death knell of municipal budgets to take reserve funds and offset operating costs with reserves, because at some point, you got to do one of two things. You got to replenish the reserve, which comes out of your operating tax base, or you have to put the service you now offset through a reserve into the tax base. And it's going to happen sooner or later because the reserve's going to run out. So you have to do one of two things. So that you're not really going to eliminate the impact on operating, you're going to defer it for a while. Or you just eliminate the service. And so what I would suggest to the committee through you, Mr. Chairman, if I may be so bold, if we're looking at the merits of the programs that are currently that have operating impacts, we can take a short break, and I can have the necessary staff here to walk you through the projects, and then we can decide on a project by project basis whether or not to go forward or not.
That'd be good.
Mr. Fairweather.
Just so if you look at the list that's before you on the screen here, you'll see that out of these projects, the ones that are 15, 16, 17, those are already underway and fully expended. So the operating impacts coming out of those projects were approved by council last year when they approved the 2017 and prior capital budgets. The ones that are before you that have future impacts are the ones that are 18s or 19 or 20 within there. So if you look at the corporate services area, the one that is in there that we can delay or not do would be the CAD project. There's implications which the chief would have to speak to on that, which really we can't do that because we would lose the ability to communicate with the other emergency services departments. But the only ones that we can really change the operating impacts are anything that's 2018 or future dated. The 17 is already underway, expended, and the operating impacts are coming into the budget. So
having said that, we can go through each of those capital projects individually, which is what both Mr. Dyke and Mr. Fairweather have suggested, and we would need a break to have people come in here and present that to us. And that would, it might affect the capital budget, but it would also impact the operating budget. Councillor Devine, you had a question?
Yes, I do. Just something Mr. Fairweather said. So anything that's 17, that's current. So any of these items here that have 17 next to them, like, well, 15, 17. So this is then, even though it was budgeted in 2017, this is now additional monies going into 2018?
What I was talking about is if I look at the fire station hasn't opened, so the council could decide not to open that. They'd have the savings.
That won't happen.
If I look at the general technology or the employee internet development, AVL, some of those have already been acquired. So what we're picking up in the future year is the licensing fees after we've bought the product. So the AVL, there's an ongoing fee for each of the units that we pay on a monthly basis. If we decided not to do it, we'd have to terminate the AVL locating devices within vehicles. Some of them we may be able to cancel, but a majority of these, if we bought software, we have the licensing fees that go with it that are attached to it.
I'm going to suggest that some of those items are fairly, nothing is minor, but some of the costs of those items are smaller than others. For example, the general technology enhancements, the internet, the AVL expansion, the Amanda, the data architecture, the government initiatives, and the Service Cambridge. Maybe what we need is a further explanation on some of the bigger items. And I don't know how much time is needed to talk about Station 6. I know what CAD is, and you can't run a fire department without CAD because you have to have interoperability between the police, fire, and ambulance. And it's all about public safety, and that's paramount. I know we've got the library as another item, and I'm not sure how many others are on there. If we need to take a break to get people to come and come and explain that to us, we can do that. Is that what the committee wants to do? George.
Mr. Chairman, can we possibly get an interim statement from the city, from Mr. Fairweather? I'd like to know where the city is to date. I mean, I know we've got a December year end, so we should have financial statements to, I'm going to say, to the end of October. We should be able to see what kind of surplus we have or not, where we are with respect to the 17 budget that we put forward and where we are currently, in order to, so then if we have these figures, then we'll know, hey, we've had, if I look at the statements, we've had 2 years, the last 2 years of 15 and 16, we've had surpluses. And it doesn't matter if we've got them in roads and sewers, these are just additional assets we've got. We've got a base there that we're growing. We don't have a lot of debt in this city, and let's look at it in the big picture. Let's try to save what Mr. Taxpayer out in the street is got to pay going forward. So if we can have these numbers to look at the numbers, then maybe we can make sort of a more reasonable judgment of what we've got. But you're asking people to, these capital projects are all worthy. They're absolutely worthy. But there must be other ways of financing these things rather than going out and hitting the taxpayer square in the head this year on. So if we had our other numbers that we can do with, so let's see the full picture because we're not seeing it. Thank you.
I'll give that to Mr. Dyke to answer.
Once again, you are getting the full picture with the information provided. As Mr. Fairweather has explained, the operating impact is the operating component of previously approved capital projects, IT licensing fees, that type of thing going forward. As we said before, we are legally not permitted to finance operating expenditures for the city. So there is no other way in which to pay for those items you see there, as we described. When we put back into 2017, the 2016, we did the 2017 budget. When we put a new capital project in, part of the piece of the information provided to council and the public at the time is with a capital project, we identify any associated future operating expense to the project is identified in that information that goes forward and it's described to council. That's what this is, as Mr. Fairweather pointed out, going forward. So with respect to your comment, yes, we have run surpluses before. We're probably going to run roughly around a break-even point for the 2017 year-end budget. That doesn't impact what we're doing here. Because this, I don't know how to explain it to Mr. Shevsky, is that this, we cannot finance this portion. Those projects there, we cannot legally finance that portion of the budget, right? Our mechanism by which, and I already talked about, yes, we could take money out of a reserve account to pay an operating expense, but all you're doing is deferring that cost to the taxpayer. Right? And if you don't want to replenish your reserve account, fine. But if you want to also replenish your reserve account at the same time, now you've doubled the cost to the taxpayer because you got to build it back into the budget, plus you have to rebuild your reserve account. So you've actually double hit the taxpayer. So my comment was before is if this is any one of these projects, we don't want to pay that fee, we would suspend that project. Some of them we can, some of them we can't. We would go through and identify which ones could and which one couldn't be. We just have to suspend the project because there is not an alternative way to finance the operating impact of those projects.
Mr. Chairman, again, with due respect, Mr. Dyke, if we're running a surplus this year, we have the ability to pay for some of these things. We have had a surplus the last 2 years. So when we're running surpluses, we can offset some of these costs to the taxpayers out in the streets. And if you can show me where you're not running the surplus, then I'm all on your side. But we have surpluses. So I hear what you're saying, but you're not, I don't think you're following what is generally accepted, financing out in the streets.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through the chair. Actually, I believe we are. If you're looking at, I mentioned surpluses before, if you're looking at taking a portion of the surplus and applying it to the operation piece, the problem you run into, it's the similar process of taking the money out of the reserve account. I mean, you have to, if that money, without knowing how that surplus was accumulated, if it was a light winter, which we'll put back into the snow reserve, but if it was an anomaly, if it's not a consistently carried forward basis, if we take a piece of that surplus and put it into an operating piece, I'm not talking about the capital piece, but the operating piece, because that's what this is here, then it's a one-of. And so next year, I have to come back and take the Amanda roadmap, for example. The next year, I have to come back and insert that $25,000 into the budget. So all you're doing is delaying the insert into the budget. So we'll probably, as our projections now, and Ms. Vera can speak more to this, is we're probably going to run at budget, break even, with no surplus. So that's the difficulty we're talking. If you're talking about using part of the surplus as a one-of to decrease a capital expenditure, that's one thing. But these lists here is the operating side of that budget. So if we were to apply the surplus to this, we're going to have to reinsert it in the budget next year.
I think what I'm going to propose at this time is that I hate to do this because we've only been back at it for 45 minutes, but I think staff need to go away and take a look at the budget and come back with some different scenarios for us. I know after hearing what Mr. Shepsky has said that he wants to see something less than 5.78. I think everybody sitting at the table wants to see something less than 5.78. We need to know what it is we want to come back, because I think if we give staff an opportunity to go back and see what they can do, we might have something that is palatable for the committee to take back to council. But I think when we keep talking about the operating costs involved in capital projects, that has to be paid for through the tax base. We can't change that. And so we have to come up with some alternative as to how we can see the tax rate decrease so that it's something that we can recommend to council. So that's what I'm going to suggest, but I'm also open for comments, and I know, Mayor Craig, you have a comment you'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate, George, all the back and forth, because I think it's good for all of us to get the different perspectives. But you know what, folks, we're coming down to one reality here. You want to reduce the budget, you have to come up with a proposal of what libraries, pools, arenas, and fire stations you want to shut down. That's basically what it comes down to. Those are the big items. And that's what we're going to have to come down to. And are you prepared to make those decisions? And that's the difficulty we have here. This is an unfortunate year when two big projects have come together. The Fire Station 6 was big for me with regards to the impact on the taxpayer and the safety of the taxpayer. And that's part of the issue we have with Station 6 as an example. You can talk about the library that hasn't been expanded in 25 years in the Galt area, whether we're going to delay it even more. Would we do that in other areas? These are the issues that we're facing. It's not up to staff to make the decisions. It's up to us to make the decisions to reduce the budget. I'm in favor, Mr. Chair, of doing all these things, of having another break. But just to remind members of council here and our other fellows that are sitting with us, you know, you look at some of the things that are happening in the region. If you look at the assessment as an example, both Kitchener and Waterloo have double the assessment we have. Why do they have double the assessment? Because they have an LRT line, and they're quite proud about it. They talk about it up at the region, how this is producing development and assessment, and they're getting the benefits of it. And I argued very strenuously a year ago, 2 years ago, we shouldn't be paying for their LRT line right now. But not only are we paying for it, we're not getting the benefits of the assessment. So these kinds of things are in the mix. And you have to keep that perspective all the time. And again, George, I come back, I think you are a positive addition here to think differently. I agree with that. But I think the real thing is coming down to, as I said, what are you going to close down, folks? That's what it's coming down to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mayor Craig. And those are the tough decisions that we have to make, because we are the ones who are going to have to make the decision at the end of the day as to what do we want to cut to get to the rate that we want to get to. And before I go on, Councillor Devine, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, through the Chair's question. Page 133, City of Cambridge 10-year capital forecast, summary by function. Are these all, every one of these projects at this point in time, they're slated for 2018? Would that be correct? 133.
Debbie, are you able to bring up 133? Oh, thanks.
Capital project for 2018.
It goes right through every year.
Okay.
So what you've got there is every project that you go through, it'll have a summary each year.
Yep.
So that's the end for
2018. Okay.
Flip over, there's 19, 20.
Okay, no, I'm more concerned about 18 right now. So are we going to be talking about these projects, I assume?
Okay, I'm gonna suggest that we take the break then, and we don't like 5.78, so we have to get below 5%. How low do we want to go? What scenarios do we want staff to come back with? Because what we projected back in 2015 for this budget year was 4.2%. We can't get to 4.2%. What can we get to? What would we find acceptable? What scenarios do we want staff to bring back to us so that we can say we're prepared to accept this? If we have numbers, we can get staff to take a look at it and see what we can come up with. Councillor Amata.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, my overall preference would be between 2 and 3, so that's what I'm putting forward. Whether that's realistic or not, that's what I would prefer, so I'll just put that forward. But I am going to hear what not to say I wouldn't support a higher increase grudgingly, and I emphasize the word grudgingly, but that's kind of what I was hoping we'd be able to achieve, and I'm just going to put that out there at this point. Thank you.
Just as you present that, then the things that we need to remember is that we have 2.83 are collective agreement settlements. We have 2.3%, which are operating expenses for capital projects. So right away, quick, that takes you well above the 2 to 3%.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, that's why on my end anyways, I'm going to have a serious thought about whether or not we should temporarily go into reserves or temporarily borrow money just until the city starts growing again. And I know that I don't like doing that. That's why I'm not even sure if I would support that. But I am going to seriously have a long thought about that. You know, there's no snow, but I'll go for a long walk and, you know, go through all that and just think about these different options. And because, you know, I know that, like, in fairness to staff, they have done an excellent job. They have. And I know that the growth in the city is not what it was before, like in terms of, you know, the development and that. You know, I think we're doing well on the industrial side still, but residential, you know, for example, Southeast Galt is held up by the bypass, right? It's held up by the road. Otherwise, a lot of that probably would have been developed by now, but because the region has to figure out where the road is, those developments keep getting delayed. But now that I think they've arrived at that, I think we are going to be seeing some major growth in the city, which will help us down the road. And what I'm saying is maybe until we get on our feet again with that, that's why I'm going to be having a look at some of these different options. So I'm just going to leave that with you.
Thank you. And do I have, is there anybody else who wants to make a statement as far as a number is concerned? Because I'm going to recommend that staff take a look at under 5 and what 4.5 would look like and what 4.2 would look like. And we have Councillor Amata who has said 2 to 3. Mr. Dyke.
Just from a reference standpoint, for going backwards to get to a 3% budget, we'd have to extract approximately $1.75 million out of the current budget.
Any other questions or comments before we break? And we're going to break for lunch, and lunch won't be here for another 15 minutes. We come back at 2. And in order to give staff some time to look at the number crunching that we've asked them, I'm going to suggest that we break until 2 o'clock. Councillor Devine. Okay, then I'm going to call the meeting and we'll break until 2 o'clock.
How many times?